Thank you for checking out the Marketing Mirror with Sue Ann and friends. Today, we are going to talk about the concept of story in marketing and media. This is an important one for all of us who are writers, digital marketers, and most certainly business owners. We need to remember that facts tell, but stories sell. So today, we want to figure out how and why, and how can you be sure you're doing it right. And today we're talking about why story matters in marketing and media. And my answer to start might just surprise you, because story starts with the brain. The goal is to understand story deeply enough that your message becomes memorable, sticky, and persuasive, even if you're not a novelist or filmmaking genius. Story is how the human brain processes information. So this is looking at the whole thing, and I think in a different light, sort of, if we think about story and the human brain. And that might be the magic to why we need story to actually get in there, to route our way through and into the brain. So I'll start with 3 quick insights from psychology that help you see why story does matter, and especially if you're marketing to people, right? The first thing that happens in your brain with story is there's a thing called pattern recognition. And with pattern recognition, our brains literally hunt for a pattern. It wants to catch on to something. So it's looking for a pattern. And of course, in story, there's often a pattern. There's setup, there's tension, there's resolution. So if there's no pattern, maybe there's no attention. So, patterns include things like frameworks and systems and formulas that we often use as storytellers, whether it be for writing in marketing or whether it be something more complex like a film or a series. We're still using frameworks, systems, and formulas. And so, people can relate to that. The next thing I want to mention from a psychological perspective, which again is a funny thing to think about when you're thinking about story. I remember when I was starting in my undergraduate school and was going to study communications and advertising, everybody would talk about psychology and how important psychology it was. I remember doing a paper on subliminal seduction and sexploitation in advertising. So truly psychology was really part of communications and advertising. And so it does make sense that the psychology of the brain and how it interacts with the stories that you tell is significant. So the second way is emotional tagging. And emotional tagging means or has to do with how emotions act within your brain, and they trigger something that's similar to having a highlighter pen on your memory. So it kind of puts that little like reminder in that book of memory. So if your memory doesn't feel something about something, if it doesn't have that highlighter moment, maybe it just gets deleted. Your brain listens to that story and it mirrors that story. So your brain syncs up, I guess is a better way to say it. And that makes a strong connection. That's something that gives you marketing power. And of course, what it comes down to kind of when it syncs up is somebody's telling the story and you're thinking about a similar story that happened to you that you can relate to. We want to trigger something in the brain that makes us memorable. Now, these principles that I'm talking about with this psychology goes back to frameworks from Aristotle's Poetics, from The Hero's Journey from Jeff Campbell, and even with more modern research like the narrative transportation theory, which that talks about how audiences who get absorbed into a story allows persuasion to skyrocket. And so particularly when we're working with marketing writing or stories, we definitely are looking sometimes for that persuasive tact. And so when we can make people feel that transformation and transport, yes, that's definitely the ticket. So sparking these unconscious, really, because they are in the brain is automatically responding. So sparking these unconscious connectors with the brain through storytelling helps you reach people at a deeper level by tickling those emotions and those shared experiences that you're mirroring. And ultimately, this makes your messaging much, much more memorable. So, from a business perspective, incorporating a story component into your core messaging, of course, is going to elevate your clarity and your positioning, and it'll create then a stronger connection and, haha, a more memorable brand. So, here's a question that we sometimes don't think about, or we all act like, oh, yeah, we're all good. But what is a story exactly? That's the question I now propose to you. So, I have a basic definition that goes something like this: a story is a narrative account of events, real or imagined, arranged so they connect and lead to some kind of meaning or effect on an audience. So, more simply, it's a sequence of related events or happenings involving a character and a setting, and usually with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But stories inform, they entertain, they may persuade, or they may do a lot more. Story structure helps to make a more compelling tale. Here's an interesting consideration, something else to think about. Stories do take many different forms. How about there's minuscule, tiny little stories like tiny memories you have between just one other person, or maybe jokes you have between friends or in your family, and those are type of story. Or you have epic stories like the Titanic, the filming of the Titanic. So you have all kinds of forms of stories, from minuscule to epic, but they also take on a lot of formats. So you have stories that are told through photography or photojournalism. You have stories told in paintings, poetry, songs, film, and of course even your social media, right? So one of the things that I've always loved about story is I've this is a weird way that you're not gonna that isn't gonna come to mind when most people think of story, but one way I've always loved to think about stories is in creating a story in an event design. So you create the theme and an atmosphere for an unforgettable guest experience. That's your goal. But what it really does is these kind of details that create these experience create many, by default, many stories happen, and many memories are made because having this theme, having the story, having an experience as part of an event makes it more memorable, creates more stories out of the event by more people involved in the event, and makes memories that last. Sometimes there's different layers of the story, right, in the event. So if I'm creating the event for a client, and the client is probably holding the event for their client, we now have different levels that we're kind of telling different stories to. And maybe part of my story as the catering production and event design person at that time in business that I did for many years, maybe I had a little story underneath all of it, where maybe something that made my brand story stand out was that my events that had these themes and these designs show, brought things that people had never seen before. And believe me, in that industry, in the food and catering industry, event industry, it's not easy to stand out. It's not easy to show people or bring out something that they haven't seen before. So when your company does things that aren't done the way that everybody else in the business does it, or that is just different or unique or unseen, that is something that gets talked about and becomes a smaller story within the story. And then when your client is happy and loves you, their story to their bosses and to their guests becomes a different kind of story. And it's all created from the original story that you create in creating the event. So isn't it weird to think about how many formats and how many styles your story and your business story can take? I guess is the point that I'm trying to make there. How do we craft a compelling story by design? Well, according to the National Center for Writing, a compelling story, whether fictional or non fictional, is a shaped journey. So it starts with a recognizable normal, it introduces a problem or a question, it escalates tension through meaningful events, and it ends in a way that satisfies curiosity or delivers insight. Good structure is less about rules and more about reliably guiding attention, emotion, and understanding. So, stories that attract usually follow a clear framework that shapes and guides the audience or reader, viewer, whatever, whichever way you want to say it, through change, a setup, an escalation, and a payoff, emphasizing resolution and growth to highlight a transformative experience. Remember that transformation is central to effective marketing storytelling. Remember that because by vividly describing or painting the picture and showcasing a happier new state, what it feels and looks like after consuming your solution, your product or service, you provide people with a vision of the story's powerful resolution. And remember, this emphasis on the user's improved state is critical for driving conversions.
Now you can surely see how essential it is for you to clearly paint that picture, that shiny resolution, showing the happy future that using your product or service will provide. But make your story magnetic for the brain while you're at it.